I came home from a 12-hour shift to find a manila envelope sitting on my kitchen table that I had not put there. My name was not on it. Nothing about it was addressed to me. But the return address said it was from a real estate closing firm, and the property address written in small print on the back was the address I had memorized as a child because it was the only place I ever truly felt safe. I opened it with shaking hands and found paperwork for a sale that had already gone through. My grandmother's house had been sold, the deal was done, the money was gone, and my brother's signature was on every single page. Before this story goes any further, I want to ask you something honest. If you had spent 2 years of your life caring for someone you loved with everything you had, and someone in your own family moved to profit from that without a single word to you, what would you do with that information? Would you confront them immediately, or would you wait and watch? Stay close, because what Ackles did next was something I think about every time someone tells me that quiet people are easy to walk over. Ackles was 34 years old when her grandmother Mira got sick the first time. Not the kind of sick that gets better after a round of antibiotics and a week of rest. The kind of sick that changes the shape of your whole life because you can see where it is going, and you know the person you love most in the world is going to need you in ways that are bigger than anything you have given before. It was a Thursday in late November when Ackles got the call from her grandmother's neighbor, a kind older woman named Ms. Paulette who had lived across the street from Mira for 30 years. Ms. Paulette said that Mira had left the gas burner on for 6 hours without noticing, and that she had found Mira sitting in the backyard in a nightgown at 2 in the afternoon, confused about what day it was. Ackles worked as a licensed practical nurse at a regional medical center 40 minutes from where she had grown up. She knew what the signs meant. She had seen the progression in patients before. She drove to her grandmother's house that same evening and sat at the kitchen table with Mira and watched her grandmother struggle to remember the name of her sister who had passed 12 years before. It broke something open inside Ackles that she was not sure she would ever fully close again. But she did not cry in front of Mira. She made tea, she held her grandmother's hand, and she started making a list of everything that would need to happen next. Mira's house was a 3-bedroom craftsman in a neighborhood that had once been modest but had slowly become desirable over the years. It sat on a corner lot with a wide front porch and a garden in the back that Mira had tended since before Ackles was born. It was not just a building. For Ackles, it was the place where she had spent every summer of her childhood after her parents divorced. It was the house where Mira had taught her to bake bread and plant tomatoes and read the clouds. It was the last thing that still smelled like the safest version of her life. The house was fully paid off. Mira had made sure of that. Ackles had one brother. His name was Denton. He was 3 years older than her, and from the time they were children, Denton had operated under a particular and unspoken belief that the world owed him something for simply existing in it. He was charming in the way that some people are charming before you have known them long enough to see the pattern underneath. He had a good job for a while in commercial insurance, then a different job, then a period of freelancing that he described as being in transition, which lasted for close to 4 years. Denton had a way of showing up when things were going well and disappearing when things required effort. Ackles had learned this about him slowly, the way you learn that a certain road floods in heavy rain. You notice it once, you tell yourself it was a coincidence, and then it keeps happening until you accept that this is simply what that road does. When Mira got sick, Denton was living in a different city about 2 hours away. He had a girlfriend named Sasha who Ackles had met exactly twice. He called Mira on her birthday and at Christmas, and sometimes he would drop in for a weekend in the summer and spend most of it on his phone in the backyard while Mira sat inside and was happy just knowing he was nearby. Ackles did not say anything about this out loud. She understood that her grandmother loved Denton the way grandmothers often love the grandchild they are most worried about, with a particular and protective tenderness that has nothing to do with logic. When Ackles sat down with Mira's doctor in early December and heard the words mild to moderate cognitive decline and progression likely over the next 12 to 18 months, she drove back to her apartment and called Denton. She explained the situation carefully. She explained what the doctor had said. She explained that Mira was still able to live in her own home but that she was going to need daily support and that the level of care she needed was going to increase over time. She asked Denton directly what he thought they should do. He said he thought they should look into hiring help. He said he would contribute financially if they found someone. He said he would come down more on weekends when he could. Then 3 weeks went by and he did not come down and no money arrived, and the woman Ackles had contacted about part-time home care called to say she needed a deposit to hold the start date. Ackles paid the deposit herself. This was how the arrangement began. Not with a conversation, not with an agreement, not with any kind of formal acknowledgement that Ackles was taking on something enormous. It began the way these things often begin in families where one person is dependable and everyone else is counting on that. It began with Ackles simply doing what needed to be done because no one else was going to do it. She reorganized her work schedule to 4 days a week and took every third weekend off from the hospital. She drove to Mira's house 4 mornings a week before her shifts began to make sure her grandmother had eaten and had taken her medication. She set up an automatic grocery delivery and linked it to her own bank account. She installed safety locks on the stove, a medical alert button that Mira wore on a lanyard, and a simple camera at the front door so she could check in remotely. Denton sent a fruit basket at Christmas. By the spring of the following year, Mira's condition had progressed enough that the part-time caregiver needed to become full-time. Ackles was spending more of her own income on Mira's care than she had budgeted for, and she had quietly started pulling from her savings. She did not ask Denton for money again after the second time he said he would send something and then did not. She told herself it was not worth the conversation. She told herself she was doing this because she loved Mira, not because she expected anything back. She believed that mostly, but there was a part of her that was keeping track in the way that people do when they have been asked to carry something alone for too long. There were moments of beauty in those months, real ones. Mira would have a clear afternoon and she and Ackles would sit on the back porch and Mira would tell stories about her own mother, about the neighborhood when it was young, about the first time she planted the rose bushes that were still blooming along the fence. Ackles would record some of these on her phone, not to share anywhere, just to keep, just so there would be something. She learned things about her grandmother during those afternoons that she never would have known otherwise, and she was grateful for them in a way that was mixed up with grief because she knew that the clear afternoons were becoming fewer. Denton visited 4 times in 14 months. Each time he came he was warm and funny and Mira lit up when she saw him, and each time he left after a day and a half and returned to his life and his transition period and his girlfriend and his city. Ackles watched this and said nothing. She had made peace with who Denton was years before this. What she had not fully anticipated was what Denton would become once the circumstances changed. In the fall of that second year, Mira had a small stroke. It was not catastrophic, but it accelerated everything. After 2 weeks in the hospital and a brief stay in a rehabilitation facility, it became clear that Mira could no longer safely return to her house alone even with daily visits. The options were a memory care facility, which Ackles had researched and found to cost more per month than her own rent, or Ackles moving into the house with Mira. There was a third option that Ackles did not consider seriously, which was doing nothing because she was not the kind of person who was capable of that. She sublet her apartment, packed what she needed, and moved into her grandmother's spare room. She called Denton to tell him. He said that was a big decision. He said he hoped it would not interfere with her career. He said to let him know if there was anything he could do. Ackles wrote these words down in a small notebook she had started keeping, not to use against him. She was not thinking that far ahead. She wrote them down because she had started to need a record of what was real. When you spend a long time being the only person in the room, your memory becomes the only evidence you have, and Ackles was beginning to understand the value of evidence. The next 7 months were the hardest of Ackles's adult life. She was working 3 days a week at the hospital and spending the rest of her time at the house, managing Mira's medications, attending her medical appointments, communicating with the in-home care team, and handling the small but constant maintenance that an older house demands. She fixed a leaking pipe under the kitchen sink herself after watching 3 tutorial videos. She cleared the gutters. She had the furnace serviced. She dealt with the property tax bill that came in February and that no one else had remembered existed. She kept the garden because it mattered to Mira even on the days when Mira was not sure who had planted it. Denton came once during those 7 months. He arrived on a Saturday afternoon with a bag of groceries that included things Mira could not eat given her current dietary restrictions and a new attitude that Ackles had not seen before. He walked through the house slowly, looking at things in a way that felt less like a visit and more like an assessment. He commented on the neighborhood, said the houses on the street were selling well, mentioned that the corner lot properties were particularly desirable. Ackles noticed this. She filed it away. She offered him dinner and they sat at the kitchen table and talked about Mira, and he cried a little when he looked at her, and Ackles handed him a paper towel and thought about the February tax bill she had paid out of her own account. Mira passed away on a quiet Tuesday morning in late March. She was 81. She had been declining for the last several weeks and Ackles had been sleeping in the room next to hers and checking on her through the night. She was there when it happened. She held her grandmother's hand. She had called the doctor and then she had sat for a while alone in the kitchen with a cup of tea she did not drink. Then she called Denton. He arrived the following day. He was composed in the way that people who have been grieving at a distance are sometimes composed. He moved through the house making practical observations. He said the garden needed work. He said the kitchen faucet was dripping. He said the house was in good shape actually, and that was good. Ackles asked him what he meant. He said he just meant it was good that it had been looked after. She watched him. She kept her face calm. She poured him coffee and let him talk, and she listened to every word he said. The funeral was 6 days after Mira passed. It was simple and honest and attended by people who had actually known Mira, including Ms. Paulette and several women from Myra's church and a few neighbors who had brought food. Denton stood at the front and gave a eulogy that was genuinely moving, and that contained 3 stories about him and Mira that Ackles had never heard before and was not sure were entirely accurate. She did not correct them. It was not the moment. The moment was for Mira. After the service, family and a few friends came back to the house. Ackles had cleaned and prepared food. She had ironed the tablecloth that she found in the cedar chest in the hallway, the one Mira had used for every important gathering. She had put flowers from the garden in 2 vases on the table. Denton received condolences from everyone and thanked them graciously and refilled their glasses, and Ackles washed dishes in the kitchen and thought about nothing at all for a little while, which was the only rest she had gotten in days. 3 days after the funeral, Ackles was sitting at the kitchen table going through Myra's papers. She was organizing things that needed to be organized: insurance documents, bank statements, utility bills she needed to cancel, the deed to the house which she had found in a fireproof box in the closet. Myra had died without a formal will, which Ackles had known and which she had gently tried to address with Myra twice over the past year. Both times Myra had become upset and changed the subject, so Ackles had let it go. Without a will, the property would go through the standard probate process for intestate succession, which meant it would be divided equally between the 2 surviving grandchildren as the closest living heirs. Ackles knew this. She had looked it up. She had accepted it. She had not loved the idea of splitting the house that she had lived in and cared for and maintained for 7 months, the house where she had been present for her grandmother's last breath, but she understood the legal reality and she was prepared to navigate it fairly. She had even thought in her more optimistic moments that she and Denton might be able to reach an agreement about what to do with the property, that perhaps she could buy out his half over time or that they could decide together. She had been thinking this for 3 days when she found the manila envelope on her kitchen table. She had stepped away to work a day shift, her first shift back since Mira had passed, because she needed to return and because the money from her savings was not going to last indefinitely. She came home at 7 in the evening to find the envelope on the table. It had her grandmother's address on the back. It was from a real estate closing firm she did not recognize. It was not sealed. She opened it. ND found the complete closing documents for the sale of the property at her grandmother's address. The sale had closed 11 days before Mira passed, not after, before. Ackles sat down on the kitchen floor. She read the documents twice, slowly, then a third time. What she found was this. Denton had engaged a real estate agent approximately 6 weeks before Myra's death. He had listed the property without Ackles's knowledge. He had obtained what appeared to be a signature authorization that the documents described as a power of attorney granted by Mira. The house had been sold to a real estate investment company. The closing had occurred 11 days before Mira died, during a period when Mira was not lucid enough in Ackles's observation to be signing anything of legal significance. The sale price was below current market value, and the proceeds had been wired to a bank account that was not one Ackles recognized, not her grandmother's primary account, and certainly not one she had any access to. She sat on that kitchen floor for a long time, not crying, not calling anyone, just reading the numbers and the dates and the names and letting the shape of what had happened become clear in her mind. Then she got up, made herself dinner, and called her attorney. Ackles had a lawyer named Constance who had helped her with a tenant dispute 2 years earlier and who had given her a business card and said to call if anything serious ever came up. Ackles had kept the card in the front pocket of her work bag. She called Constance's voicemail and left a calm and specific message describing what she had found. She mentioned the dates. She mentioned the power of attorney. She mentioned the timing relative to Myra's death and Myra's documented cognitive decline. She said she would scan and send every document she had, then she went to bed. She did not call Denton that night. This was a decision she made deliberately. She needed information before she made moves. She needed to understand what had actually happened before she confronted the person who had made it happen. She had learned this about herself over the years. She was slow to anger and fast to think, and that combination, which had sometimes frustrated people around her, was about to become the most important thing about her. The next morning she called in a personal day from work. She scanned every document from the closing packet. She went through Myra's papers again more carefully this time, looking for any record of a power of attorney document. She found nothing in the house. She did find in a small leather organizer in Mira's bedside drawer a receipt from a notary service dated about 7 weeks before Mira's death during a period when Denton had been visiting. She photographed it. She noted the date. She wrote it in her notebook. She also found something else. In the same drawer, tucked behind a birthday card from Ackles that Mira had kept, was a handwritten note in Mira's handwriting from several months before the sale. It was addressed to no one in particular, just written the way elderly people sometimes write their thoughts down. It said that she hoped Ackles would be comfortable, that she had worked so hard, that she deserved to have the garden. It did not say anything about Denton. It did not use the word inheritance or the word house, but it was there, and Ackles photographed it, and she put it in a folder with everything else. Constance called back at noon. She asked Ackles several questions. She asked about the timeline of Mira's cognitive decline and whether it was documented by a physician. It was extensively. She asked whether Ackles had any evidence that the power of attorney had been signed during a period of diminished capacity. Ackles described the visit where Denton had come and the notary receipt she had found and the general trajectory of Mira's decline as documented in her medical records. Constance was quiet for a moment and then said that what Ackles was describing had several potential legal avenues, including a challenge to the validity of the power of attorney on grounds of lack of capacity, and potentially a fraud claim depending on what additional evidence came to light. She also said plainly that this was going to take time and that Ackles needed to be prepared for that. She said that real estate transactions that had already closed were not easy to undo, and that even with strong evidence it was not a simple process. She said she needed a retainer to begin working on the case, and she named a number that was significant but not impossible. Ackles said she understood. She said she would get the retainer together. She thanked Constance and hung up and sat for a moment with the reality of what she was undertaking. She was alone in this house that had already been sold. She was the only person who had actually been here. She was the only witness to what Mira's mind had and had not been capable of in the weeks before her death. E was the only person who had been in this house every single day for 7 months, who had paid the bills and maintained the property and held her grandmother's hand through the hard nights. And she was the one who had come home to find the closing documents on her kitchen table, delivered apparently by Denton or someone acting for him, as if she were being served notice. She wondered for a moment if he had expected her to do nothing. She called him that evening. She kept her voice even. She said she wanted to talk about the house. There was a pause on his end that told her everything she needed to know about what he had anticipated from her. He said sure, yeah, he had been meaning to call about that. He said he had made a difficult decision while Mira was still alive because he had been in a financial situation and the timing had been what it was. He said the property was going to have to be dealt with eventually anyway. He said Mira had agreed to it, had signed everything, and that it was all done properly. Ackles asked him when Mira had signed. He said he didn't remember the exact date. She asked him what account the proceeds had gone to. He said it was complicated and that he had debts she didn't know about. She asked him directly whether he had shared any of the proceeds with her. He said he was going to talk to her about that. He said he had just been dealing with a lot. He said things had moved faster than he expected. He said he was sorry she had found out the way she did. She said she appreciated him explaining that. She said she would be in touch. Then she ended the call. She wrote down everything he had said word for word as close as she could reconstruct it with a timestamp at the top of the page. She put it in the folder. She went to bed and she slept, which surprised her. But she had made a decision, and decisions, even hard ones, tend to quiet the mind once they are made. Over the next 2 weeks, Constance filed a formal notice of dispute with the title company and the real estate investment firm that had purchased the property. She obtained a copy of the power of attorney document through the title company records and sent it to a handwriting specialist. The specialist's preliminary assessment was that the signature, while resembling Mira's handwriting, showed characteristics consistent with a person in a compromised physical state, particularly the pen pressure and the inconsistency in letter formation. The specialist noted that a more formal assessment would be needed for any legal proceeding. Constance also obtained Mira's medical records from the treating physician with Ackles' help, specifically the records from the 8 weeks surrounding the date of the power of attorney signing. Those records showed that during that window Mira had 3 documented episodes of significant confusion, that her attending physician had noted moderate to severe memory impairment, and that she had been assessed on 2 occasions as unable to manage her own financial affairs without supervision. This assessment had been made by the physician. It was written in the chart. It was dated. Ackles sent these records to Constance. She also sent the photographs of the notary receipt and the handwritten note from Myra's bedside drawer. She wrote a detailed timeline going back 14 months of every bill she had paid, every caregiver shift she had arranged, every medical appointment she had attended, every repair she had made to the property. She attached bank statements showing the transfers out of her own account. She attached the work schedule records showing her leave days. She attached the remote check-in logs from the door camera. It was an enormous amount of documentation, and it had all existed because Ackles had simply lived her life carefully and kept records of things because she was a nurse and organization was something she did naturally. She had not kept records because she anticipated needing them. She had kept records because that was who she was, but they were there, every single piece of it. Denton called her twice during this period. The first call came 8 days after their initial conversation. His tone had changed. He was less loose, more controlled. He said he had spoken to someone, a friend who knew about real estate matters, and that friend had told him the transaction was perfectly legal and that Ackles had no claim on the property or the proceeds. He said he understood she was upset and that grief did strange things to people. He said he hoped they could keep the family peace. Ackles said she appreciated him calling. She said she was working through some things with her own advisors. She said she would be in touch when she had more clarity. She hung up and wrote down the date and the substance of the call. The second call came 4 days later. His tone had changed again. Someone had clearly told him something he had not known before. He was less composed this time. He said he had heard she was making inquiries, that she had been asking questions about the sale. He said he was asking her as her brother to let this go. He said it was done and that fighting it would only cost her money she did not have. He said Myra had wanted him to have the house. He said Myra had told him that herself. Ackles asked him when Myra had told him that. He said he didn't remember the exact conversation. She said she understood. She said she had no more questions for him right now. She ended the call. She wrote it down. 3 weeks after Constance filed the dispute notice, the title company responded. They indicated that they were reviewing the transaction and had placed a temporary hold on any further transfer or development of the property pending the outcome of their internal review. This was not a legal victory, but it was a pause, and a pause was enough for now. The real estate investment firm also responded, through their own legal team. Their letter was formal and somewhat aggressive, asserting the legitimacy of the transaction and threatening to counterfile if the dispute was not withdrawn. Constance read the letter and told Ackles that the aggression was actually a good sign in her experience, that companies who felt completely secure in their position tended not to threaten quite so loudly. Ackles received this information calmly. She was still living in the house. No one had asked her to leave, possibly because no one was quite sure yet whether there was a legal basis for asking her to leave given the dispute. She was still paying the utilities from her own account because the bills still came in and she was the one who was there. She had not missed a day of work. She had not told anyone outside of Constance and one close friend named Yolanda what was happening. Yolanda was the kind of friend who listened more than she talked and who asked the right questions. She came over on a Saturday evening and Ackles made dinner and told her the whole story from the beginning. Yolanda listened without interrupting. When Ackles finished, Yolanda was quiet for a moment and then she said one thing. She said that Ackles needed to make sure people knew what she had actually done, not in an angry way but in a real way, because the story that was going to be told about this situation was going to be shaped by whoever told it first and loudest, and Denton had a head start. Ackles thought about this. She understood what Yolanda meant. Denton had always been good at narrative. He was the one who could walk into a room and tell a version of events that made sense to people even when the version left out most of the important parts. She had watched him do this her whole life. She had watched him do it at the funeral. She was not interested in a public fight, but she understood that silence was also a kind of statement, and that it was not always the one you wanted to make. In the 6th week after Myra's death, Ackles received an unexpected call from a woman named Tess. Tess was the adult daughter of Ms. Paulette, the neighbor who had called Ackles 2 years earlier about the gas burner. Tess said her mother had asked her to reach out. She said Ms. Paulette had something she thought Ackles should know. Ackles went to see Ms. Paulette the following afternoon. Ms. Paulette was in her early 70s, clear-eyed and precise, and she had lived across the street from Myra for long enough to know the rhythms of the household in the way that close neighbors sometimes do. She told Ackles that about 7 weeks before Myra died, she had seen a man she did not recognize park outside the house and go inside with Denton. They had been there for about an hour. When they left, the man was carrying a briefcase and a folder. She had thought nothing of it at the time, but after Myra died and she had seen some activity around the house involving people she did not know, she had mentioned it to Tess, who had told her that a property dispute was underway. Ackles asked Ms. Paulette if she would be willing to write down what she had seen and sign it. Ms. Paulette said yes without hesitation. She wrote a clear one-page statement while Ackles sat at her kitchen table. It described the date as best Ms. Paulette could remember it, the description of the man with the briefcase, and the duration of the visit. It was witnessed by Tess. Ackles thanked Ms. Paulette and carried the statement home with both hands as though it were made of glass. She sent it to Constance that evening. Constance called the next morning and said this was helpful. She said that paired with the medical records and the handwriting analysis and the notary receipt, they now had a picture that a probate court would have significant interest in. She said she was going to file a formal petition to the probate court to have the power of attorney declared invalid on grounds of lack of capacity at the time of execution, and to request that the court appoint a special administrator or to investigate the circumstances of the sale and determine whether the proceeds should be recovered or the sale set aside. She said this was going to take months. She said it was going to be unpleasant. She said Denton was going to have to respond to the court formally and that his response would be on record. She said Ackles should prepare herself for him to say things that were not true and for those things to be in writing. She asked Ackles one more time whether she was sure she wanted to proceed. Ackles said yes. She said it without hesitation and without drama. She said it the way she said most things, which was simply and clearly as a statement of what was true. The petition was filed. Denton received notice through his attorney. Within 3 days of receiving notice, he called Ackles 4 times. She did not pick up. She let each call go to voicemail. He left 2 voicemails. In the first one, he said he thought they should talk before this got out of hand. In the second one, he said that what she was doing was going to destroy the family and that he hoped she understood that. She transcribed both voicemails into her notebook and forwarded the recordings to Constance. There was also an email. It came from a family acquaintance named Warren, someone Ackles had met twice at family gatherings over the years. A person who was ostensibly close to both her and Denton, though she had always found this characterization generous. Warren's email said that he had heard there was a situation with the estate and that he hoped things could be handled privately and that families needed to stick together, especially in times of grief. He said Denton was going through a hard time. He said he hoped Ackles would consider what Mira would have wanted. Ackles read this email twice. Then she wrote a reply. She thanked Warren for reaching out. She said she was handling the matter through proper legal channels and that she was confident the process would be fair. She said she agreed that Mira would have had clear feelings about what was right. She pressed send and closed her laptop. 2 months after the petition was filed, the probate court held an initial hearing. Ackles was there with Constance. Denton was there with his attorney, a man named Gerald who wore a good suit and spoke with the practiced fluency of someone who was comfortable saying questionable things in formal settings. The hearing was procedural. Both sides submitted their preliminary documents. The court set a schedule for further submissions and a full evidentiary hearing. Judge, a woman in her early 60s named the Honorable Marie-Claire Tessier, reviewed the preliminary filings and made an observation from the bench that she noted for the record. She said that the court took questions of capacity at the time of execution of any legal instrument seriously, and that the combination of documented medical findings and the proximity of the signing to the signatory's death warranted careful examination. She said this was not a ruling. She said it was an observation. But she said it on the record and it was in the transcript, and Constance leaned over and wrote something on her notepad and underlined it. In the months that followed, the discovery process began. Both sides were required to produce documentation. Denton's side produced the original power of attorney, an affidavit from the notary who had witnessed it, and communications between Denton and the real estate agent. The notary's affidavit stated that Mira had appeared willing to sign and had stated her name correctly. It did not address the question of whether Mira had understood the nature of what she was signing. The real estate agent's communications showed that Denton had initiated contact with him about 6 weeks before the signing and had discussed wanting to move quickly. Ackles's side produced the medical records, the handwriting analysis, the notary receipt, Ms. Paulette's statement, Ackles's detailed timeline with supporting bank records and work documents and camera logs, and the transcribed voicemails. They also produced, at the last moment, something that Constance had found through her own investigation. It was a text message exchange obtained through proper legal channels through the discovery process between Denton and the real estate agent that had been sent 2 days before the power of attorney signing. In one message, Denton had written words to the effect of, "She won't know what she signed tomorrow and it needs to be done before my sister figures out what I'm doing." Ackles read this message sitting in Constance's office. She read it once and put it down on the desk and looked out the window at the parking lot for a moment. Then she picked it up and read it again. She kept her face still. She did not say anything for a long time. Then she said quietly that she wanted to make sure the process was done correctly and that she did not want anything set aside because it had been aimed improperly. Constance said it had been obtained through proper discovery. She said it was admissible. She said she was going to include it in their evidentiary submission. Ackles nodded. She folded her hands in her lap and looked at her knuckles for a moment. Then she said that she was ready to continue. The evidentiary hearing was held on a Thursday morning in late autumn. Ackles dressed carefully. She wore a gray blazer over a white shirt and she sat at the table next to Constance and kept her hands flat and still. Denton sat across the aisle with Gerald. He did not look at her when he came in. He had gained some weight since the funeral and he looked tired in a way she did not think was only from the legal process. She looked at him for a moment and felt something that was not exactly pity but was in the same neighborhood. Then she turned back to her folder. The hearing lasted most of the day. Both sides presented their evidence. The handwriting specialist testified. Mira's physician testified about her cognitive state in the relevant period. The notary, looking uncomfortable, testified that he had conducted the witnessing in approximately 12 minutes and had not asked any questions beyond confirming the signatory's name. Ms. Paulette's written statement was entered into the record. The text message was entered into the record. Denton's attorney made arguments about the validity of the power of attorney and the legitimacy of the sale process. Constance made arguments about capacity, about the timeline, about the documented medical evidence, and about the meaning of the message that said she won't know what she signed. Judge Tessier listened to all of it without interruption, taking notes in a small leather binder. She did not rule from the bench that day. She said she would issue a written decision within 30 days. The hearing ended at 4 in the afternoon. Ackles walked out of the courthouse into the gray autumn light and stood on the steps for a moment and breathed. Constance stood next to her and said she thought it had gone as well as it could have gone. Ackles said she thought so too. Then they shook hands and went to their respective cars. Ackles drove to the house. She made herself dinner. She sat in the kitchen where she had sat so many times over the past year and a half, and she thought about Mira. Not about the legal case, not about Denton, just about Mira. She thought about the clear afternoons and the stories in the hands she had held and the garden she had kept. She thought about the way Mira had always said in her direct and unhurried way that the most important thing a person could do was to be present when it mattered. Ackles thought she had done that. Whatever happened next, she had done that. 26 days after the hearing, Judge Tessier issued her written decision. Constance called Ackles at 8 in the morning and read the relevant portions over the phone. The judge found that the evidence overwhelmingly supported the conclusion that Mira had lacked the legal capacity to execute a valid power of attorney at the time of signing. The medical documentation was extensive, specific, and uncontradicted by any compelling counter-evidence. The notary's own testimony that the signing had taken 12 minutes and had involved no assessment of understanding was noted as relevant. The text message, which the court described in careful language as deeply troubling evidence of intent, was cited as corroborating the medical conclusions. The power of attorney was declared invalid. The sale of the property was declared void ab initio, meaning it was treated as though it had never legally occurred. The title to the property was restored to Mira's estate. The real estate investment company was ordered to return the purchase funds and vacate any claim on the property. They had 30 days to comply or face further sanctions. The matter of the disposition of the estate assets, including the house, was referred to the probate court for standard intestate proceedings, with a note that any claims by Denton to a share of the estate could be subject to further challenge given the court's findings. Ackles stood in the kitchen and held the phone and listened to Constance read and did not say anything until Constance was finished. Then she said thank you. She said it simply. She said she needed a few minutes and she would call back. She put the phone down on the table and looked out the window at the garden. The rose bushes along the fence were dormant, but they were there. They were still there. She thought about Mira saying that the most important thing was to be present when it mattered. She stood there for a while, then she went to make tea. In the weeks that followed the ruling, several things happened in sequence. The real estate investment company complied with the order and returned the purchase funds to the estate account established by the court. Denton, through Gerald, initially indicated he intended to appeal. 2 weeks later, Gerald filed a notice that Denton was withdrawing the appeal. Ackles did not know what had happened in the conversation between Denton and Gerald that produced this decision, but she could imagine it. Legal fees had to be mounting significantly on both sides, and the ground on which Denton was standing had become very narrow. The probate process for the estate then proceeded normally. As the two surviving grandchildren, both Ackles and Denton were heirs under the intestate succession laws of the state. However, Constance had filed a separate motion for an equitable offset, arguing that the court should take into account the financial contributions Ackles had made to the care and maintenance of the property over the 14 months she had served as Mira's primary caregiver, contributions that were documented in extraordinary detail. The motion cited the bank records, the work leave documentation, the caregiver invoices, and the full accounting of repairs and maintenance expenses Ackles had personally funded. The offset motion was heard by the probate judge in December. It was not contested by Denton's side. The judge granted the motion and determined that Ackles was entitled to a credit against her share of the estate that reflected the documented financial contributions she had made. The net effect, once the house was valued and the estate was processed, was that Ackles received a significantly larger share of the proceeds than she would have received in a straight 50-50 division. The exact figures were between her and Constance and the court, but they were fair. For the first time in this entire process, they were fair. The house itself was listed through a legitimate real estate agent, this time with both heirs notified and participating. It sold within 3 weeks at full market value, which was meaningfully higher than the price Denton's original transaction had captured. The neighborhood had continued to appreciate. The garden, Ackles noted quietly to herself, contributed to the curb appeal in the listing photos. When the final distributions came through, Ackles sat with the bank notification in her hand for a long time. It was not a fortune, but it was real and it was honest, and it was hers in a way that could not be argued with. She thought about what she was going to do with her portion. She had been living out of savings for much of the past year and a half, and the legal fees had taken a portion of what she had left. But after the estate distribution, there was enough to do something meaningful with. She thought about her grandmother's note in the bedside drawer. I hope Ackles will be comfortable. She hoped so too. She started looking at property, not in the neighborhood where Mira had lived because she was not ready to stay that close to what had happened, but in an area she had always liked, about 20 minutes from her hospital, with good streets and old trees and houses that had been cared for. She found a small house with a yard. It needed work, some of it cosmetic, some of it structural, but nothing she was afraid of. She had learned in the past 2 years that she was not afraid of most things that could be fixed by showing up every day and doing the work. She made an offer, it was accepted. She signed the documents herself, reading every page because she was now the kind of person who read every page, and she had been earning that habit for a long time. Denton did not contact her directly during this period. There was one message that came through a mutual family contact, something vague about needing to put the whole situation behind them, something about how families go through hard things. Ackles read it and thought about what to say for a day or two. Then she wrote back through the same contact and said that she was doing well and that she wished him the same. She left it at that. She was not interested in a performance of reconciliation that was driven by his needs and his timeline. If something genuine ever developed between them, it would have to come from a different place than this. She was not closed to the future, but she was not going to pretend the past had not happened. Yolanda came over to the new house on the first weekend after Ackles moved in. They sat on the back steps because there was no outdoor furniture yet and Ackles had not gotten to that. Yolanda looked at the yard, which was overgrown and a little wild, and said she thought it had potential. Ackles looked at it too. She thought about Mira's garden. She thought about the rose bushes along the fence of the house she had grown up visiting, the ones that had been there since before she was born, the ones that had still been blooming when the listing photos were taken. She thought she might plant some things here, not roses maybe, something that made sense for this yard, for this soil, for this version of her life. She had spent so long taking care of things had belonged to other people, things that other people had built or inherited or claimed. This was the first thing that was entirely hers. She could plant whatever she wanted. She could build whatever she decided to build. She could be whatever she had not yet had the space to become. She looked at the overgrown yard and she felt, for the first time in a long time, something that was very close to peace. Not because everything was resolved and fixed and tied up cleanly. Not because there was no grief left in her about Mira, or no complicated feeling left about Denton, or no weariness from the months of documentation and hearings and quiet, difficult effort. But because she was standing on ground that was hers, in a place she had chosen, having refused to let someone else tell a false story about her life and gotten away with it. She had been the dependable one her whole life. She had been the one who showed up, who stayed, who paid the bills and kept the records and held the hands. She had been easy to overlook because she was not loud about any of it, and people have a habit of overlooking the things that run quietly and reliably, the way they overlook a well-maintained house until the day it stops working. But quiet does not mean absent. Steady does not mean harmless. Dependable does not mean forgettable. Ackles had not forgotten a single thing, and in the end, that was what had made all the difference. Ackles did not win because she was louder than Denton or angrier than him or more willing to make a scene. She won because she had been present every single day for 2 years, and she had the records to prove it, and she had the patience to let the truth do the work. If this story meant something to you, I want to hear from you. Have you ever been the one who quietly carried everything while someone else positioned themselves to benefit? Have you ever had to choose between keeping the peace and protecting yourself? Leave your honest thoughts in the comments because Ackles' story is one that a lot of people know from the inside, and your experience matters here.